When you think of your mom, what do you think of? Like as you reflect back on your mom, for some of you, it might be, you reflect back way in the past. For some, it might be current still. But when you think of your mom, what memories come to mind about who she was or who she is, about her character, as we talked about even this morning in Bible class. And if you think about kind of the attributes or the drive that made her who she was or who she is, what things come to mind? I'm trying to see if my mom's in here. She's right there, so I better watch out what I say. But as a young person, did you ever feel that your mom had too much control or was trying to direct you too much? Maybe not giving you as much freedom as you wanted? So when I think of moms, when I think of my mom, when I just think of others that I have known that have played that role in my life in one capacity or another, I see someone who's tenacious. And maybe that tenaciousness reveals itself differently, but tenacious in the sense that they won't let go, that they're committed to their children, committed to those who they love, and they want their best for those that they love, and that they won't let go. And maybe that reveals itself in different ways in all of our moms or in our families. But there's a sense that a mother has a personal vested interest in her children, right? That she wants the best. And so as a young man, when I felt like I didn't have enough freedom and I kicked against the direction that mom gave me, I didn't see that. But looking back, I see that. I see that mom wanted best for me. And so the direction that she gave, the thoughts that she gave, the career advice that she gave, everything that she gave was for my best, not for her best. Mom's sacrifice. And within that context, we've been real blessed to be studying Genesis the last little while. And we have some examples of moms that show the good of what I just described and where it can go bad, right? When we look at Sarah and when we look at Rebecca, that's not going to be our main text for today, but just as a reflection, when we think about Rebecca as an example in Genesis 25, if you want to turn with me real quick, or you can just follow along, but in Genesis 25, we see in verse 21, and Isaac entreated or prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. We read in chapter 25, verse 21. And the Lord was entreated of him. The Lord heard him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived, right? And her children struggled together within her. And she said, if it be so, why am I thus? If I'm having a child, what's going on with me? And she went to inquire of the Lord. Now, an interesting phrase there, because you got to focus on this one, because we're going to now do a compare and contrast in about 3 or 4 minutes. But she goes to inquire of the Lord, of what is happening. You've heard my husband's prayer. You probably heard my pleas. I'm having a child, but something's going on inside. Maybe I feel like my child is fighting with himself or herself. And she gets the direction from the Lord, and the Lord says unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. And she's told that she's having twins by God, and that those twins represent 2 peoples, 2 nations, and that those 2 people also represent the fact that there's going to be kind of a flip in the world upside down for her and her husband, because the older is going to serve the younger. And what's interesting, if you now read through from Genesis 25 to Genesis 26 to Genesis 27, all the way to Genesis 32, where we were this morning, the pattern that we see is we don't see Rebekah inquiring of the Lord. We see Rebekah very quickly feeling that she needs to take ownership of what God has told her. And now pay attention to that phrase. She takes ownership of what God has told her, and in a way needs to make sure that that's going to take place. Okay? And that's a dangerous place to be, because we see the consequences for Rebekah. It does play out that way. It probably would have played out had she not taken things into her own hands. But as we heard last week, she sent her son Jacob on what she thought was going to be a few days or a week or so journey to get a wife. It ends up being many years later that he comes back, and she passes away between when she sends him and when he comes back. And so there's consequences that her actions created that they didn't have to necessarily. So she heard what God said. And she said, well, I got to make this happen. And so she actively set up situations to make sure that what she heard from God would happen. And in a way, got ahead of God, right? Kind of made it her mission rather than looking to God to say, God, what do you want me to do with this? How is this going to take place? At least from the evidence that we have. Now, we're going to contrast that with Hannah, actually, in 1 Samuel, which is going to be our main text. And so turn to 1 Samuel with me. And what's fascinating about this, as we look at this contrast and this comparison, is that this is for all of us. Moms, this is for you as an encouragement and as an exhortation. But what plays out in the contrast, and as you consider taking matters into our own hands, and as we can contrast it with what Hannah does, there's some fundamental truths that bubble up that are apparent and useful for every one of us. So don't just pass out and stop paying attention because this is for moms. That's not the case. So a little bit of background as to what's happening in 1 Samuel. We find, if we were to look at chapter 2, verse 12, we read, and now the sons of Eli were the sons of Belial. They were wicked men. They knew not the Lord. And the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant came while the flesh was in seething with a flesh hook and 3 teeth in his hand, and he struck it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the flesh hook brought up to the priest took for himself. So they did in Shiloh unto all the Israelites that came thither. And we would continue to read in here, but we need to understand the context of what's happening to really understand the enormity of what Hannah's doing. So the context is that the temple, the place where they're gathering, where the priests are at, things aren't going well. That might be an understatement, but let's just imagine church, where you were coming to church, and the treasurer and the ministers were skimming off the top on any donations that were made, and were living high off the hog off of your donations. Imagine if there was gambling going on in the church, right? Imagine if there was even worse things going on in the church, in the back rooms, behind closed doors, where there was immorality taking place within the context of the church, and where the services were just tradition and ritual and just kind of going through the motions, and there was no heart in the services, and there was no heart left in this church. If that was the church, right, would you feel good about coming? Right? No, right? Absolutely not. Would you feel excited to be here? No. Would you maybe be thinking about going to a different church? Probably. That's the situation that we find ourselves in as we start to look at 1 Samuel chapter 1, is a situation where the temple is rampant with immorality, where the priests are skimming off the top, and they're living off the people. They're taking the best for themselves in a lot of cases, and there is nobody that's really holding them accountable. Eli, the high priest, kind of scolds his sons and says, you shouldn't do this. That's not a good idea. And then leaves the rest for them. And it goes in one ear, out the other, and they keep doing what they're doing. Okay, so that's the background of this story. So within this context, we start with chapter 1, and we read, now there was a certain man of Ramoth Amazophim of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And this man went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. So what I read in chapter 2, we're rewinding a little bit, right? We're going to be a number of years earlier. That's from chapter 2 in chapter 1. But we are going to see evidence that what I just described that was happening, that's in chapter 2, is already happening in chapter 1. And so we'll see some evidence of that. But we have a man with his family. He has 2 wives in this case, with his family, who's making the trek to Shiloh to worship at the temple. Now, as a little bit of background, what do you suppose is the likelihood that he doesn't know what's going on? Word travels fast. Bad news travels even faster, right? And so the fact that things aren't going so hot in the temple is probably common knowledge. Yet he's going. He's taking his family. They're going to the temple to make sacrifice. It says something about his character, and it says something about just the character of his family and the diligence and the focus of the family to say, we're going to make the trek from where we're at over to Shiloh, to the temple, where there's immorality, superficiality, where everything is just ritual and perfunctory and just kind of going through the motions, and where the priests are, by the way, skimming off the top, to sacrifice. Now, a little bit of background that helps kind of clarify at least part of the reason why maybe they were going is that if you're from Ephratah, you're also from the house of Judah. And we read in 1 Chronicles chapter 6 that Samuel was the son of a Levite. And so Elkanah is a Levite. And Levites, if you recall, have a special focus on what they're supposed to be doing at the temple. And so we see a man who's dedicated. And we see a family who's focused on their dedication to God. Now, I have to, just fully transparent, if it was me and I knew all this was going on, it would be challenging to take a deep breath and say, all right, we're going to go do what we need to do with all of that happening in the background or in the foreground when I get there, right? So it would be challenging. Yet they do it. And so now let's keep reading. And the 2 sons of, in verse 3, and the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and her daughters portions. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah. But the Lord had shut up her womb, and her adversary also provoked her sore for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. And now, interesting thing here, I don't know if this was very common back then, because we saw it with Sarah, we saw it with Rebecca, now we see it with Hannah, was that it's interesting that the main player that God has us to look at as far as the women goes, always having a tough time getting pregnant, right? So Sarah couldn't get pregnant. Rebecca couldn't get pregnant. Hannah can't get pregnant. Sarah takes matters into her own hands. Remember, right? We won't go into all of the details, but Sarah takes matters into her own hands. Rebecca, Isaac at least prayed to God. God heard the prayers. They had children, right? So here we are. We see trouble in the family. There's already competition between the two wives. It's interesting now that he sees Hannah differently. She's the one that can't have children, yet it says he loves her, and he gives her a double portion. I tried to dig in and understand exactly what that meant. There's some thinking that as at the sacrifice, everybody got a portion. He almost, it sounds like some would say, gave her his portion at the sacrifice. So he was actually taking what he would generally either give or was taking back from after the sacrifice and gave it to her. So it shows how much care he had for her. There's something about Hannah. He loved her. We don't know what it is yet. It bothered him that she couldn't have children. And so as we read, if we continue reading, in verse 7, as he did so year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, that's what he gave her, so she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. Then said Elkanah her husband to her, Hannah, why weepest thou? Why eatest thou not? And why is thy heart grieved? Am not I better to thee than 10 sons? Like, am I not treating you well enough? Don't you see that I love you? Don't you recognize that I care for you? You need to eat. I'm giving you my portion. You need to eat. It bothered him that she was troubled. You can tell that he had love for her. And so he's trying to do his best for her, and he's trying to encourage her. Not necessarily the best way to encourage. Am I not better to thee than 10 sons? Might not be the best way to encourage guys, a wife who can't have kids or is struggling. But he was trying. You got to give him some credit. He was trying, okay? And so that's now, we got two backgrounds going. We've got all the political, geopolitical stuff and the awfulness of immorality in the church or in the temple. And we have Elkanah, Hannah, and they're coming to be at the temple. And Hannah rose up in verse 9 after they had eaten in Shiloh and after they had drunk. And now Eli the priest sat upon a seat by the post of the temple of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul. She was not in a good place, right? She was mourning. She was really struggling, and prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, not forget me, but will give unto thy handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. So Hannah, in a deep place of hurt, really longing to have a child, says to God, I'm nobody, God. I'm nobody. I don't deserve to have you hear me. But if, just by chance, you listen and hear me and see me, don't forget me. Don't forget me. Right? I know I'm nobody, and I know I don't deserve to have you hear me, but please hear me. Please. Don't just overlook. Don't just go by. Don't just focus on the people that are more important. And if you give me a gift, if you hear me and you give me a gift, I promise to give it back to you. Now think about that for a second. God, I really, really desire a child. And if you hear me and give me that gift, I'm going to take that gift and give it right back to you. I'm going to dedicate that gift right back to you. I've got no promise of other children. I've got no promise of anything else. But I promise to give it back to you. Isn't it interesting that hurt that she was feeling, maybe the loneliness that came with being barren and struggling, caused her to reach out to God and commit to something that's so similar to what we see a sinner say when they convert. Isn't the response of a sinner who's been redeemed and realizes the salvation that they have through Jesus Christ, what's the response? Oh, good. Thanks, God. I'm off on my own. See you later. Appreciate the salvation. We're good now. I'm just going to go live life, right? No. The response of a heart, the response of a soul that has recognized the salvation that comes through Jesus Christ is an immediate giving back. And saying, God, that gift is so big, I'm yours. I'm giving that gift right back to you. You gave me salvation, I'm giving my life to you. Right? That's the response of a sinner that's been redeemed when they realize what they've been given. That's the response, is to give back. And we see in Hannah a maturity, a wisdom, a heart that understands God. This isn't something that's just that's ritual for her, right? This isn't something that she's coming to Shiloh every year because her husband's a Levite, because this is what they're supposed to do, and so she's just going through the motions. No, this is a woman. This is a woman who recognizes who God is, recognizes what he deserves, and the cry of her heart is to give back to him what he gives her. And so that little nugget that I mentioned that's visible for all of us, the first one is to recognize in Hannah ourselves, okay? Not just for the mothers, but for every one of us. Do you realize as you cry out to God, maybe you haven't cried out to God yet, but if you do, and if you have, if you did, does the enormity of the gift hit home to the point where you actively say, God, you've blessed me so much with the salvation that words cannot describe it, but I'm yours, and I'm living for you, and I'm dedicated to you, and my goal is to do your work. Right? Your purpose is what I'm about. So, little nugget there. This young woman, wise beyond years, says something to the Lord God that we say today when we respond to him. And so if you respond to God, recognize that the salvation that we get requires a response, right? Requires a response. And it came to pass, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli marked her mouth. And this is where we start to get, and it goes a little further, but we get a sense that things are not right in the temple, okay? Now Hannah, she spake in her heart. Only her lips moved. This woman was in such turmoil. You've been there probably. Maybe, somebody said, are you what are you doing? Are you muttering something? Or if you were on Zoom today, people would say you're on mute, Bob, because your mouth is moving, but you can't hear anything. And that's what she's doing. She's in prayer. She's in thought. And her lips are moving as she's thinking and saying things in her head. She's not verbalizing them. And Eli notices, right, the priest. And his immediate thought isn't that here's a spiritual woman. Here's a woman who's got deep sorrow in her heart, who's got things going on and trials in her life that I need to reach out and support her. Right? That's not his immediate thought. What's his immediate thought? His immediate thought is that she's drunk. That's what tells us that's what gives us hints that this is not a good time at the temple, right? Because if I saw somebody by themselves in a corner in church, head bowed, lips moving, but no words coming, I'd be like, something's wrong. Not that she's drunk. And so we can sense that things are not good in the temple. And so he says, wherefore Eli thought she'd been drunken. And Eli said unto her, how long wilt thou be drunken? And so we see again Eli, in a way, almost doing the same thing that he says with his sons. Like, you shouldn't be doing this. How long are you going to keep doing this? It's not a good idea to drink, right? So that's to get drunk, right? That's what he's saying. Now Eli said unto her, how long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thy wine from thee. And Hannah answered and said, no, my lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Count not thy handmaid for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. No, sir. I don't know exactly what they call the high priest then, but she says, no, I'm not drunk. I'm sorrowful. I'm mourning. I'm struggling here. I'm struggling. I'm in a bad place. What's interesting about Hannah and about her husband is that regardless of the state of the temple, right, regardless of the state of the temple, they come. They come. Regardless of how others are behaving at the temple, they come. And you got to ask yourself, right, if it was today, would we do it? Right? Would we be seeking another alternative route or another alternative source, or would we come if things looked like they were falling apart? Because they looked like they were falling apart. And yet, Elkanah and his family, Hannah, they come. She goes into the temple knowing that all kinds of stuff is going on at the temple, and she's there weeping, mourning, praying to God. They're personally committed. Okay, so one, she is personally committed to God. Not to the temple. She's committed to God. He's committed to God. So both husband and wife, the family is committed to God. In a way, they recognize that God is worthy. He is worthy to be praised. He is worthy to be adored. He is worthy to be worshiped, regardless of what's happening. And so the things that, like, these are all encompassing thoughts for all of us, because sometimes, even for myself, for all of us, right, we align the way we're feeling and the way we're struggling with things, and if we're not happy with the way things are going in a certain situation, let's say in church or in another part of our lives, right, we won't attend. But do we realize that independent of my own attitude, of how I feel about how things are going, God is worthy to be worshiped. He is worthy to be praised. And that individually, I have to do that. And she came and she praised God individually, regardless of what others were doing with the sacrifice, regardless of the abuse at the temple, God was worthy. They saw God for who he is. They didn't filter him kind of through their own experiences. They didn't filter him through the lens of what was happening in the background. They recognized that God can hear, that God is worthy, that God is holy, that God can do in spite of the circumstances around him. And so they come, and she prays, and she makes a vow and says, if you deliver me, if you save me and give me salvation by giving me a gift, the gift of a child, I will give that child right back to you. And as I'm saying that, think about the context that she would be giving that child back in. Would you give the gift back to the temple? There's fornication going on. There's immorality going on. There's superficiality. There's just ritual. There's skimming off the top. There's trying to cheat God. That's the temple. And she says, God, if you give me the gift, I'm giving him back. I'm going to give him back. Where does she give him back? Well, in that day, you give him back at the temple. Where there's immorality, there's fornication, there's skimming off the top, there's superficiality going on, right? Would you give him back? Is the promise just a promise in the moment of passion, in the moment of conviction, like because I'm so burdened that I'm making this promise, or is she truly committed to giving him back? We know the answer if you know the passage. She does go through with it. But would you? Would I? Or would we find a reason not to give the gift because things aren't looking so hot? Now, we know that she has the child. And we could read in verse 17, Eli answered and said, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked him. And so it's interesting that Eli doesn't petition on her behalf. He's already at this point, it's interesting that he's removed himself. And we continue to see these hints of how bad things are. Because he says, may God grant you your petition. He doesn't intercede on her behalf. He doesn't lift up hands to God. He doesn't bow down and prostrate to God, himself to God on her behalf. He just says, I hope God, I pray that God would grant you your petition, that your request would be granted. But God does. He grants the petition. And if you were to read through 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 19, all the way through verse 20. Well, let's just read it. Maybe starting at verse 25, towards the end of the chapter. And they slew a bullock and brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee here praying unto the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition, which I asked of him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. And so she gives him the child into a place that is not good. Into a place that is not good. Now we know the rest of the story. If we continue to read, Samuel becomes the first prophet in a while that God's words come out of, and they don't fall to the ground. They become something that's really important into the time of Israel, right? Samuel becomes a prophet of God. He becomes instrumental in the first king, in Saul. He becomes instrumental with David. He becomes instrumental in building God's kingdom through the nation of Israel for that time. And yet he was dumped into a place that was awful because of a promise given to God. Now, Hannah prays, and I just want to conclude this quickly, but Hannah prays. In chapter 2, Hannah has a prayer, and it's fascinating. It's awesome to read this prayer together, because what we see in this prayer is we see the heart of a woman of Judah whose husband is a Levite, who is committed, she is committed to God and has followed through on her promise, trusts God, didn't take matters into her own hands, but followed through on her promise. And as she follows through on her promise, this is her prayer. And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. Mine horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over my enemies because I rejoice in thy salvation." So she goes, I win. I win because I trust in you. Because I trust in you. You are my salvation. I'm given abundance through you. And the question for us is, do we fear the future? Or do we fear what we can't see resolved because we just can't see it working out? It's impossible. Things just are not going the way they're supposed to. Things are going downhill. They're only going to get worse. Throw up your hands and say, I wish I wasn't here. Or do we rejoice in God and in the salvation that he provides? Right? Do we rejoice in the salvation that he provides? Because we cannot foretell the future. And even though things look like they're going downhill, and I want to just give up, and I want to just throw up my hands, or I want to just walk away, we can't. If we look at what Hannah did, and we look at the example that Hannah gave, and the prayer that she prays, because I rejoice in thy salvation, right? I win. Because I trust in you. Because you save, not me. There is none holy as the Lord. There is none beside thee. Neither is there any rock like our God. Talk no more exceeding proudly. Let not arrogancy come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of mighty men are broken, and they that stumbled are girded with strength. They that were full have hired out themselves for bread, and they that were hungry ceased. So that the barren has borne 7, and she that hath many children is waxed feeble, so that the poor become rich, the weak become powerful, and the powerful become weak, and the rich become poor. Right? God is in control, she says. God is in control. The Lord maketh poor and maketh rich. He bringeth low and lifteth up. He raiseth up the poor out of the dust and lifteth up the beggar from the dunghill, to set them among princes and to make them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he hath set the world upon them. God is in control. He will keep the feet of his saints, and the wicked shall be silent in darkness, for by strength shall no man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Out of heaven shall he thunder upon them. The Lord shall judge the ends of the earth, and he shall give strength unto his king, and exalt the horn of his anointed. I don't know if you caught that last phrase. There is no king at this point. There is no king in this land. There is no king. They just have judges. Right? Saul is the first king. He's in the future. She's praying a prophetic prayer. She doesn't know it. But she's praying about the future. And is she praying about David or is she praying about Jesus? I can tell you she's praying about Jesus. Because when we look in Luke chapter 1, Zacharias talks about he quotes her. And if you look at Luke chapter 1, Mary's prayer, Mary's statement after she visits her cousin Elizabeth, is almost a repeat of Hannah's prayer. I'm emotional because in the hands of somebody who has dedicated themselves to the Lord, in the lives of somebody who is committed to God and trusts in God for their salvation rather than themselves, you might not know what you're saying when you pray. You might not know that you are prophesying. You might not know the impact that you will have when you trust and look to God for your salvation rather than taking matters into your own hands. Rebecca listened to what God said, and then she manipulated events and circumstances to get to the conclusion. Hannah trusted, took one day at a time, cried to God, tried to be honest and have integrity and live with truth in every moment. And God blessed it. That doesn't mean that we won't have challenging situations in life. That doesn't mean that there will be times where we're not sure what to do. But if our hearts are on God, rather than trying to manipulate events, rather than trying to take things into our own hands, rather than trying to anticipate or read the future, God will bless the situation, and who knows, just who knows, where it'll end up.